Hello and welcome to episode 9 of Kubernetes 101. Today I'm going to interview the CTO of Amazy.io, our series sponsor, and talk to him about an open source Kubernetes project that helps with Drupal deployment especially, but also for other things called Lagoon. We're also going to talk about open source and managed hosting versus DIY and all those kind of things about Kubernetes. So as we begin all these episodes, please, whether you're watching this live and you have live chat up, or if you're watching it after the fact, please leave a comment or a live chat saying where you're from and saying hello. It's always awesome to see such a global audience for these videos. And it's funny, this series on Kubernetes actually has, it only has like 22 or 24% viewership from the US, which is amazing to me. Most people that I know who do content on YouTube for technical things, if you're an American, it's mostly a US audience. So I love seeing that global community. And someday when this coronavirus stuff is over, maybe we'll get to see each other again. So today, before we get into the interview, I want to talk about kind of a spectrum that I see a lot of times when you get into Kubernetes. And throughout the series, we've learned about all of the small building blocks of Kubernetes. We started with learning a little bit about containers and the history of where Kubernetes came from. Then we started building very small services in Kubernetes, and we kept building on top of that until we started learning about controllers and operators and all that kind of stuff. And once you start synthesizing everything together, you're going to start trying to figure out the best way to deploy your applications, and ideally in a scalable way where all your teams can manage their own applications, and the operations people can focus on operations, and the developers can focus on developing. And you're going to need to integrate tools for continuous integration and continuous deployment in your cluster. And there's a spectrum here that I'm showing on the screen of kind of flexible to bespoke applications. And on the flexible side, you have tools like Jenkins, GitLab, and Argo and things. They're extremely adaptable. You can use them for almost any use case, and you can integrate almost any workflow into them, but they require a lot more upfront configuration. You have to spend a lot of time managing the tool to get it ready for your applications. On the other side of the spectrum, you have things like a fully custom operator and a custom application you might write to integrate with it and a web UI for it. You can do that, and a lot of companies do that for their applications. But it's great for the focus that it has and the simplicity you can get out of that. But if you do need some more complex integrations and things with external services, that becomes more of a burden of building that. In the middle of this line, I think there's products like Lagoon, which is also open source, and we'll talk a lot more about it in the interview. But it's not meant to do everything for everyone, like some of those tools that are super flexible and have been around forever. But it's also not written so narrowly that you can only use it for one use case. It's written in a flexible way that's adaptable and maintainable. So anyway, a lot of these tools it's a buzzword, and I put it in the title of this video mostly because a lot of people might watch it just because it says GitOps. GitOps is a buzzword, and it's kind of like DevOps. It doesn't mean a whole lot. It basically means using Git to base your operations and deployments and things, which a lot of us have been doing for years, just we never called it GitOps. So I don't really like using the word, but it is an easy way to say we use our Git repository to kind of manage the workflow of deployments in our application. Meaning you might have a main or master branch that deploys to production, and you might have a development branch that deploys to a development environment, or you might have pull requests that build their own environments, things like that. And so we're going to talk about that in this interview, and I'm excited to be able to talk with Michael. I've known him for many years, but I guess we'll get right into it. In episodes 4, 5, and 6, we learned how to run a Drupal site in a Kubernetes cluster, and I mentioned in each of those episodes that many of the behind-the-scenes cluster features that are really hard to maintain can be taken care of by a managed hosting provider like our series sponsor, Amazy.io. And a lot of people have asked exactly what Amazy.io does and what this Lagoon thing is that I've mentioned does. And today I'm happy to have one of Amazy.io's founders and a longtime friend in the open source community with me, Michael.
Hello. Hey, Jeff. Good to be here.
Yeah. Before we get into anything else, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and where you're from and how you got started with Amazy.io and Lagoon?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Michael. I'm originally from Switzerland, so that's the weird accent. My native language is German, but I live in the US now since multiple years. Um, I'm at the East Coast in the US, but I used to live in Austin. And fun fact, I lived in an Airstream for more than a year last year, because as a Swiss native, I've not seen much of the US, so I decided to live in an Airstream and be another place every week.
Wow.
Yeah, what helped me found Amazy.io? It's scratching an itch that we had. We, as a Swiss company, had to host in Switzerland, and there wasn't really a good hosting provider that we really liked. So how it goes, you write your first script to fix one problem, and then you add another one and another one, and without realizing, you build a whole hosting team and a whole hosting platform. And at one point, people asked us more and more saying, can we host with you? Because I really like what we see. And initially we said, no, that's not our business model. But over time, we realized that what we've built is actually something really cool. And so we started to open basically the gates for other people to use it. And that's how we ended up with Amazy.io. And that's how also our main focus is to really build a really cool hosting platform that is really loved by developers.
It's interesting you mentioned that you kind of grew it organically out of, we needed to do some hosting and then our customers liked it so much. There's a few companies that I love and I've worked with in the past, and all the best ones seem to have come from that approach where they didn't really start off doing hosting, but they got into it because they needed to do it and they were really good at it because they were so customer driven. So what was it, this is a whole series about Kubernetes and getting started with it. And we approached this question in the first episode of, why would somebody use Kubernetes? What was it about Kubernetes that made you think about using it for your platform and really jump right into it?
For us, it was all about offering additional application support for our teams. Amazy has used Drupal many years, but in the last years, we saw a lot of push into what the Drupal community called getting off the island. And one of them was also using additional services. So we saw things like popping up, people wanted to use Elasticsearch instead of Solr, or they started to use decoupled frameworks with Node and things like that. And our hosting solution at that point was very focused on Drupal. It was really good in deploying PHP. But as soon as you now need to run Elasticsearch additionally, or especially Node.js also on server side, we realized it's going to be very hard for us to create servers that have capabilities to run all these different things. So we needed to find some layer of abstraction. And of course, at the beginning, there were VMs. And of course, we thought about, we have a VM that has Node installed, and we have a VM that has Elasticsearch installed, and you started them. But then at the same time, we also saw a lot of teams wanting to have very modern development workflows, meaning they wanted to create pull requests and they wanted to have environments for each pull request to test before it's merged into, let's say, the master branch. And up until that one, at that time, you maybe had hosting solutions that could deploy 2 or 3 environments, but never like 50 or 100 in real time on demand. And these two things together really had us looking out into the world of containers. We always used Docker locally for local development to start and stop containers real fast, but we didn't really believe that it's possible in production because Docker Compose was really flaky and it didn't really work, and managing it and just running a Docker Compose up via SSH or so was just not really how I imagined a production grade system to run. And that's when we found Kubernetes. And the first, I would say, hours or days or weeks were definitely very hard because the understanding that it's fully declarative. So you just tell a cluster how many pods you want, and the cluster decides by itself where these pods are going and how many nodes do we need for that. And I attach storage automatically, things like that. So the first weeks were very funny because, it's just so many things you didn't expect it to do. But over time, we really learned to understand and love it, to open ourselves up as a team, as a company, to accept how it works. And I think that's that's our journey on how we ended up with Kubernetes.
Yeah, so you mentioned that, the first weeks were kind of crazy. I think anybody who dives into Kubernetes finds that same experience. And the one thing that we saw in this Kubernetes 101 series was it took 3 episodes to go from not having Drupal running into Kubernetes to having a good version of Drupal in Kubernetes, but still not something where you're getting those things that you were talking about, the branches that deploy and pull request deployments and things like that a lot of people love to be able to do. So I was wondering if you can give, and a couple people have asked for this directly in the comments, so I'm interested to see, can you give me a demo of how Lagoon is working with Amazee.io hosting and show people like what is possible here and why it is cool to have products like Lagoon?
Sure. Yeah, I would love to. So what we have here is a Drupal project. It's open in my Visual Studio right now, and we see in the Composer JSON, we, for example, run Drupal core. So this is a Drupal core 9 with a couple of additional plugins installed, like Drush and Lagoon logs and things like that. And so that's your standard Drupal projects like you will find anywhere else. There's a couple of special things though in there, and what we call it is Lagoonized, and it's also supported for Lando. So Lagoon uses Lando to run containers locally. So for that there is a Lando YAML. The Lando has a recipe for Lagoon, so Lando understands this is Lagoon, and there's also a Lagoon YAML that we're gonna go a bit further later to look into it. But in the end, all I do if I go to my terminal, I run Lando start, and Lando now sees all the different containers defined. What is super cool, and one of the main thing for us, a reason that we wanted to use containers, we can now run the same containers on my local computer that will also later run in the Kubernetes cluster. So Lando will start the exact same Docker images that that are maintained by the by the Lagoon team, and we can run them. So Lando start now gives me a URL, and if I copy that and open this in my browser here, we can see it runs me a full Drupal 9 with the umami demo test with a little bit of special title here. But this is now basically my Drupal environment that I can code in, that I can play with, I can work, and it runs the exact same containers that we're also going to have in production. So let's assume I'm a developer and my project manager tells me I need to change this. They want to show, instead of 2, they want to show 4. So I go in here and I'm do the site building that is needed as a Drupal. So I'm going to go here and I change the 2 items to 4. And I do that and I save it. And if we go back to the site, we see it has 4 now. Great. So what I can do, I want to push this now to the site. I want to show this to the world, what I just did, because so far I only worked locally. So I can run Lando Drush config export, which will export the configuration, Drupal 9, as a configuration management system. And so it will export that. And so it will now compare the different configurations, and it will tell me, hey, you changed the view promoted items. I want to change this. And this is really this should be here for any change. I could have done theming changes, install modules, disable them, whatever else I might do. It's just super easy. So if I run a git diff, I can see now I changed the items per page from 2 to 4. And I say, okay, I want to commit this now. We see I'm currently in the main branch, and I'm going to commit this directly in here. So I call this the 4 boxes. Oh, git. I'm going to add and commit, and I'm going to push this. Now, on this push is where the magic happens. If we see this git push is connected to a GitHub repository, and this GitHub repository is connected to Lagoon. So when GitHub receives the push, GitHub will send a webhook to Lagoon to tell Lagoon, hey, there's a new push for the project Kubernetes 101. So if we go into the Lagoon UI, so this is the Lagoon UI where I see all my different projects. I created the project before, and all I had to tell Lagoon is that, hey, there's a Kubernetes 1.1 project, and that GitHub URL. That's all I had to set up. And so now what Lagoon does, it automatically creates me new environments for every branch that I push. So I pushed in the main branch, so I'm also going to look into my main environment, and in here there's a deployment tab. If we click on that, we see there's a deployment running. So Lagoon realized that this is the Kubernetes 1.1 project, and it will automatically talk to a Kubernetes cluster that Lagoon has access to, and it will fully automatically deploy that site without me needing to run any Helm commands or log into the cluster or do anything at all. It just does it fully automatically. If we look here, there's a bit more information we see. So Lagoon, for example, has the understanding of different environment types. So it knows which one is the production, which one is development. We can see when it was created, when it was last deployed, and all kind of other stuff. So this deployment, what is going to happen now is that it will automatically check out the Git repository, and it will build the Docker containers, it will push them to Kubernetes and all this other stuff. So everything that we saw in your episodes before, all these manual processes of running Helm or writing Kubernetes YAMLs, that's all completely done by Lagoon. We see it is complete now. And if we go back to the overview, we see there's a route. So what Lagoon does is for each environment, for every project, we see this is the main of Kubernetes 1.1. Lagoon automatically creates a route, so I can visit that specific environment. And if I click on here, it opens that up. And what we expect now is to have the same Drupal that I have locally running, also with my 4 recipes on here. So that's basically how easy it is with Lagoon to push something up into a Kubernetes cluster. What I mentioned though before is that I said one of the main things for us that we went to Kubernetes is the pull request. What I did now is I push directly into main. Maybe my customer, or maybe I don't like this with the 4. It looks a bit weird. So I maybe want to actually do this first for another way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shortly revert this git commit, because I say, oh no, actually I didn't like this. So I revert this and I push this again. So what will happen now is the main branch is going to go back to only show to what we saw before. Now, while this is running, I'm going to go to my local site, to my Lando, and I'm going to run a config import, or no, actually I don't need to. So I go here and I say, okay, I actually want to change it to 6. Let's say we want to do 6. But this time, before I push this into the main branch, I want to show it first, let's say to my front-end developer, or I want to show it to my stakeholders to show them what's going to change before we actually change the main branch. So I have 6 here now. So we do the same as before, but this time I first create a new branch. So I call this the feature, and we call this the front page 6 boxes. And now what I do, I add my changes. So I run the Lando Drush config export. And this will do like we saw before. It will export the configuration. And yes, that's what we want. And again, this could be any other change as well. I could install additional modules. I could write some new code, do theming. What else? So this is done. I can shortly run a git diff to verify, okay, this is the change that I wanted. Now I add this, commit, show 6 boxes on front page. And I'm going to push this now into my GitHub as well. Now, if we go back to the Lagoon configuration of the project, we see one of the things that is defined here. You can tell Lagoon for which branches you want to create environments. And in this case, this regular expression only says do main and develop. That's why we have the main and develop. So my branch that I just pushed will not create a new environment, but we see here there are pull requests enabled. So what I can do now, I can go into my actual GitHub repository, and I see it tells me that I pushed this new feature. So what I'm doing is I'm creating a new pull request from this feature into the main branch. And this pull request will again create a webhook that is sent to Lagoon. And Lagoon will see that this document or this setting here says pull requests are enabled. So it will automatically create a new environment that will merge this branch into this branch. And so if we go back and update, we see there's a fresh new environment created that is called the PR4. And if we go into deployments, we see there's also a deployment happening. So Lagoon will now automatically talk to the Kubernetes cluster and will create a completely new namespace with new database connections, new ingress objects, new storage, everything completely new. Now, all the Drupal developers out there, they probably know, okay, that's nice, I can deploy Drupal, but where's the database coming from and the files? And Lagoon has a solution for that. If we go back to the Lagoon YAML, we see that we can define a lot of different things. So it's a YAML file. And one of the main things in here is called post rollout. So these post rollout tasks allow you, as the developer, to have full control of what Lagoon does during the deployment step. So in this case, we define in the post rollout, so this is after all the containers are running, Lagoon will run this little bash script. And this bash script says, hey, first check if you have any tables of node. And with that, we check if Drupal is installed. And if there's no Drupal, which is going to be the case in my PR environment, we have an integration of Drush and Lagoon, but we also have integrations with all these other applications as well. So if you have Laravel, Node.js, we can tell Drush to automatically synchronize the database from the main to the PR itself and also the files. So what this will do, it will automatically take the database from the main environment and synchronize it to the PR environment. And then it will run another command called drush config import, which will import the config because we changed the config. So the change will be there as well. And then we'd run a drush updb and a drush cache clear. And these tasks are automatically run for me. So I don't have to do anything special. All I do is I push the code and it will run them. And you have full control. So you can run your bash scripts, you can create your own shell scripts that you need. So you have full flexibility to change or modify the behavior of how Lagoon deploys your application. So if we go back here, we see the PR4 is complete. And now in the overview, like the main before, we have a route here that is called PR4.Kubernetes 1.1. So this environment has created a completely new route as well. And it also created automatically a Let's Encrypt certificate for us because Lagoon integrates with Let's Encrypt. So when this is loaded, we see we have a full-fledged Drupal, but with our 6 boxes running that we told it in the configuration. And now a front-end engineer could take this branch, pull it locally, update the CSS so it looks pretty. They push again. Lagoon will deploy again. I can show it to whoever needs to see. And then when they're happy, I say, OK, now I want to merge this. And as soon as I will merge, Lagoon will realize again that there is a pull request, that there's a commit happening because there's now a commit in the main branch. So if we go back to the main branch, we can see there is a deployment running. And we also see the PR4 is magically gone because Lagoon also realized that this pull request is now closed. So the environment does not need to exist anymore, and therefore it automatically will remove the environment for me on the Kubernetes cluster. I don't have to do anything. It's automatically fully cleaned up. And that's where Lagoon uses GitOps, where the branches of the Git repository actually tell Lagoon which environments should exist, which not, and stuff like that. And that's it. That's basically a run through how we, or most of our developers that we see using Lagoon, how they use it with pull requests, running it locally, and things like that.
So that is pretty awesome. I know GitOps is a huge buzzword sometimes, but when you really see the flexibility it gives you and the power in that your developers for your projects can just push branches or file pull requests, it just makes things so much easier because you don't have to deal with having like two blessed environments that they can deploy into, and people are no longer are they walking over each other accidentally because they had two things they had to test in the same week. So it's really awesome for team-based development, or even for me when I'm working on a project on my own. Sometimes I want to have the ability to have a separate environment, and having to run it locally is not always an option, especially if I'm sharing that environment with somebody else, having them test it or having them take a look at it before I want to deploy it to production. But how does all this work under the hood? And is this all proprietary, or is there anything that's open source that runs any of this backend component?
Yes.
Show me some of that stuff.
Cool, I'm glad to. So yes, to answer the question first, no, everything that you just saw is completely open source. So Lagoon, which is the piece that receives the webhook and connects to the Kubernetes clusters and deploys everything and does all of that stuff, it's completely open source. It's released under Apache 2 license, and it's hosted on our GitHub repository. And also Lando, the piece that is completely open source, all the Docker images that we use for to run in the PHP and all the MariaDB and all that stuff, that is all open source and can be seen by everybody. And we also have customers that actively contribute back to the system, because that's really the power, is that they not only have a cool hosting solution, but they also have one that they can modify themselves.
I love it. So I love it when I'm able to take something that is breaking and figure out the fix and send it back, and the vendor will actually care because it's open source and I can do that. A lot of times when you find that kind of thing with other hosting systems, the vendor is like, we'll take a look at this, and 2 years later it's still a bug.
Yeah. And that was one of the other reasons that we also started our own hosting solution, because I used to be a Drupal developer, a site builder that built sites, and you configured something and somehow didn't behave the same way locally as in production. And the first thing you want to do is look at the code, look at the Varnish configuration or the Nginx to see what is there, because I want to solve a problem. And I always felt like I don't have access to it. There's a wall somewhere that doesn't allow me to see what's happening behind, because this is some kind of safety thing, or they want to protect something that I really never understood. So when we built Lagoon, we said we're going to make it open source, because it's not really about protecting anything, because if you look at the stack, if you look at the Drupal side, from the Linux to all the plugins, the services, the PHP, and Drupal itself, everything is already open source. So why should the hosting platform itself not be? And the other side is we believe people and our customers can solve problems faster if they have access to everything.
Yeah.
So that was one of the main reasons that we also said we're going to make this open source from the very beginning, and we're not going to be afraid of it.
Yeah. Can you show me some of how it works?
Yeah.
Some people might not even know if it's open source. Where can they go to take a look at some of this code too?
Yes. So I want to walk you through is that what is happening, and let me show this left and right. So I'm going to open Lens, and I'm not sure if you showed it already to some of you in the Kubernetes 101 series, but it's basically a UI for Kubernetes. So it shows you all the different pods and the different pieces that are running inside the cluster, and I can look at them. So instead of running kube control, I can look at Lens, which is in some cases a bit easier. So what I'm going to do, I prepared a pull request over here. So I'm going to create a new pull request. And we're going to see of what we saw before, where Lagoon will create a new namespace and create all the different pieces. We'll see this in real time happening on the cluster. So I have my develop branch here, and I'm going to merge my feature 4 boxes that I created before. So we'll create this pull request. And as soon as this happens, Lagoon will tell me that there is a new environment, the PR5. And if I shortly go to my cluster, I see there's a new namespace for the PR5, and we see a build pod running. So how Lagoon works is there is a Kubernetes controller running inside that cluster. That cluster is called Amazee.io CH4. It's a cluster in Switzerland. And that controller that runs in the cluster talks with our main Lagoon, and they together now tell each other that there should be a new build. And the controller that received a custom resource, so we define our own custom resources with Lagoon build, and this here now created a build pod. So this build pod is started by the controller and has access and the knowledge of everything that should happen. So if we look at the environment, we see, for example, we see which branch, that it is a pull request, we're not in a CI environment, which environment type, and we also have the different, because this is a pull request, we need the different hashes of the different branches that should be merged, this repository, plus also there is an SSH key as well that then will allow this build pod to talk to the Git repository. So this build pod will now clone the Git repository from GitHub and will start to look at all the different YAML files. So if we go back over here, in the Lagoon YAML, we define on top a Docker Compose YAML file. And this Docker Compose YAML file, which is not a Lagoon specific file, it's by the tool Docker Compose, but this Docker Compose tells Lando for locally, but also Lagoon, which different containers should be started. And in here we have some labels. So we say for the Nginx, there's a label that says Lagoon type Nginx PHP persistent. So Lagoon has different types of services that it supports, and all we do is we tell it, hey, this is the Lagoon type of this. We also can say Lagoon persistent, because we need some persistent storage that then Lagoon will automatically provision for us. And we also have the Docker files in here that are defined. So if you look in Lagoon, there is an Nginx Docker file, and in here we say how this should be built. So for example, we see a composer install and stuff like that. And so all these files, they are now parsed by the Lagoon build pod, and then it will realize that there's some Docker images to be built. They will automatically be built, and they will then be pushed into a registry. And then Lagoon, with the help of Helm, so Lagoon internally uses Helm to create all the different YAMLs. It will then create, for example, 2 deployments for the Nginx and the CLI. It will, for example, create some persistent volume claim. So Lagoon realized that this Nginx wants some persistent storage, so it automatically created some storage. It will create all the different necessary services, and it will use ingresses to get the traffic in it. This one, for example, has an annotation in here, the Kubernetes TLS Acme true, which then tells the cert manager to get an automatic Let's Encrypt certificate. So there's all kinds of things that are all happening at the same time that the Lagoon build pod basically talks now to the Kubernetes cluster and creates all these things. And then at the very end, it will also run the tasks that we saw before here. So the Lagoon here, it will run all these tasks. And only if all of this is done, if all of this was successful, we see that the build pod itself is completed. And then the controller that runs in that container, in that cluster, will realize that this build is done and will talk back to Lagoon and say, hey, the deployment is done. So that then if we go into the Lagoon UI, if we go here to deployments, we see that the Lagoon build is complete. Plus, if we actually click on it, we see all the build logs. So you have full access to you can see exactly which YAML files are created by Lagoon. So if you're unsure why something happens in a specific way, you can see all the builds, all the files. You see, for example, the build process. So if we search for Composer install, we see here how it ran Composer install inside the build pod. Plus, if we also go to SQL sync, we see here how it ran the SQL sync, and you can see the actual output of them as well. So you can see everything that happens that Lagoon does for you, because that's the other important piece. Lagoon has the idea that it wants to make all your life easier, but it doesn't want to make it so that it's like a black magic or just a box that you send something. Lagoon wants to make sure that you as a developer or an engineer, you understand exactly why it did something. And it will tell you with very verbose logs why it took specific decisions in that specific way. And so that's why, for example, the build logs include all of this.
All right. Well, thanks for that comprehensive demo and the peek under the hood. I think it's good that we are doing this as episode 9 and not earlier in the series, because I was thinking about having there be a demo of Lagoon earlier, and there could be a little demo and it would be fun to see, but we just got through talking about operators and how they use a controller to control things in your cluster and manage applications. And I think Lagoon is a prime example of an entire system that's written inside of Kubernetes that expands Kubernetes and makes it, in this case, unbelievably awesome at deploying Drupal, but it can also deploy other things too, Node.js and other applications. And I'm sure that as time goes on, it keeps expanding to be able to do more and more just as easily. And the one thing that I'm wondering, though, is, Lagoon is open source, Kubernetes is open source, all these things. That means that you can download the projects and install them yourself. So one question that I have, and that I know a lot of people have, is what would be the advantage of paying a company like Amazy.io for managed hosting versus installing things on their own and running their own cluster, especially since once you get it working, it looks like it's super easy. What are the things that the managed hosting can provide that someone that might be just getting into this on their own hosting environment would not want to have to deal with?
Yeah. We see many customers that we have that they start initially play with Kubernetes by themselves. They play either with Kubernetes and a bit of Helm, or they already try Lagoon. The situation though with Kubernetes is that while Kubernetes itself, getting a cluster running, like this cluster, for example, runs in Google Cloud in Switzerland. All we do is you can go to Google in the UI and just click your cluster together, or you can do the same at AWS. We, under the hood, we use Terraform because we want to make sure that the clusters are the same everywhere, which just makes it a bit easier. But yes, getting a Kubernetes cluster running is super easy, and connecting it to Lagoon is super easy. The hard part gets when we talk about 24/7 and also management and maintenance of the whole cluster. So Kubernetes in itself has no logging system, for example. Lagoon comes with a full-fledged logging system based on Elasticsearch and other pieces, but if somebody, let's say one of your pods, creates thousands of log entries every second, then your Elasticsearch gets overloaded, and so you need to monitor this. The same is the cluster itself also needs monitoring. It could be that some developer pushes code that causes the container or the pod to die after 1 hour of running. And if you don't have proper monitoring that figures this out, and also if you don't have a team behind that receives alerts and can look into them, you could end up with a situation that your site or whatever you're hosting on it just behaves really strangely, really weird. And that's where we see most of our customers, they come to us because they don't have, for example, a 24/7 team. Or they don't have a team consisting of really experts in, let's say, storage solutions or Linux kernel situations. Like just this week, we had the sudo issue on, there was a security issue in sudo. And we have a full security team that just saw this, what happened. They look at it, they go to the clusters, they decide what needs to happen. They create all the tickets for the different teams, and the teams run and go and make sure that everything is as fast as fixed as possible. And that's where I see the value of having a company that runs your Kubernetes clusters. It's really about making sure that these Kubernetes clusters are running 24/7, that they're monitored, that they're correctly scaled, but also not too much scaled, because it can be very easy that you pay suddenly a lot of money to the to the cloud providers, because the Kubernetes cluster will just start new nodes as it wants, and it's going to be very expensive. But also, of course, secure. I think with a system like Docker that gives a lot of flexibility to a lot of people, making sure that everything is secure is a key important piece. And we just don't see a lot of teams or companies having all these capabilities. But if you are a freelancer, if you just want to play with it, I think it's the perfect solution for anybody to just get a Kubernetes cluster running, connect it to a Lagoon, and start playing with it. If you don't have the requirement to run stuff 24/7, that's what it is here for anybody to use and to play with.
Yeah, no, that seems to be the route that a lot of companies I've worked with go on. And sometimes almost every time that I've seen a group go in on a custom Kubernetes solution, they either get so deep into it and it gets so behind that the project is either canceled or turned into something else, or they decide, you know what, we're going to go with this managed solution. Mm-hmm. And the thing that's great, though, is there are some people sometimes like me who are doing it for hobby, or someone who just does have a lot of expertise and the time on their hands, and they just love it. And they can get something like Lagoon running separately outside of any managed hosting environment. And that's one thing that I love about a lot of the open source communities that I work in, is people have this philosophy of, if you do have that time and effort and the expertise, here, we want you to do this, and you can contribute back and make it better and all that. And I just did a video last week on open source in enterprise environments and how things seem in a weird state right now. Compared to when I got started in, a couple decades ago, it seemed like the philosophy of open source was always fighting at odds with enterprise. But nowadays, it seems every big enterprise is like, we love open source. But I think some enterprise companies and some even small to medium business companies just don't really get it and don't do the right things or don't have the right idea about open source. So how does Amazy.io work in the open source communities that they participate in, like Drupal and Lagoon and Kubernetes and things like that? And what makes it important to you to be good stewards or do what you do with it?
Mm-hmm. So I personally, when I started in the Drupal community, I went to DrupalCon Copenhagen, and I've never been really involved in open source before that. And I just went to that DrupalCon, and I met so many people that explained me things that I didn't know. And there was just such an open environment that people said, hey, you maybe don't know a lot, but we'll find you something to work on. And it was just such an environment that I felt like this is something that I want to give back to, because I learned a lot. As a company, we hired many people from the Drupal community. We found a lot of the first customers we found from the Drupal community that they saw this little hosting company that had no customer yet, and they just said, okay, yeah, I'm bringing all my sites to you. I'm going to do this. And this just like this openness and this trust caused me or caused us to say, okay, we need to be a good citizen of this. And this for us, this means we do everything we do open source. Even small internal tools or things like that are open source first. We try to not, or we don't have, for example, a fork of Lagoon internally that we use, and then there's one publicly. It's the same environment, which forces us also to do really good behavior in terms of releasing and hot fixes and stuff like that. But it goes much further than code. It also means giving our employees time to go to conferences and events, sponsoring the conferences and events, because without the sponsors, these events would not survive. And also trying to be very open of like using other tools. One of the main things that we try to do in Lagoon, if we try to implement some kind of new feature, we first look into the community if there is already something. And if there is, and let's say it maybe does 80% of what we need, then we still take it, we improve it, or we build what we wanted, and we contribute it back. That's, for example, we have a really deep GitLab integration with Lagoon, so that like if you have projects in Lagoon in GitLab, it automatically creates a new project in Lagoon, and you can log in with your GitLab account into Lagoon. We found a webhook that wasn't there in GitLab. So one of my engineers that never built Ruby before, we're not a Ruby team, he got the hours, he spent hours and hours to figure out how it works and sent the pull request back. And it got accepted, and we have the feature now in it that we needed. And so we made GitLab better, and in the end, we made our company function as we wanted. And I think that's really the piece that we not only see ourselves as like the company that open sources it, but we try to use a lot of things. That's, for example, like if you look at Lagoon, it's not a lot of code that Lagoon really does itself. It's maybe a couple of thousand lines of code, but it's hugely important to use other systems like Helm. We use OpenDistro for all the logging stuff. We use Keycloak for authentication. We use GraphQL, a lot of pieces of the open source piece of GraphQL to communicate with the servers. We use Kubernetes, of course. All the controllers we build, or the operators, they're all built with the controller framework. So it's a lot of pieces that we already use and actively contribute back to them.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that you really got into open source after going to a DrupalCon, because there were two instances in my life that I think really sold open source for me and the community, and both of them were Drupal. One was on an IRC channel meeting Angie Byron Webchick the first time. I had this really dumb problem, and she helped me for like 20 minutes figure this thing out on internet chat. And like, I didn't even know who she was at the time, but afterwards I was like, oh my gosh, she's like a big name in the Drupal project. And she spent time to help me, a nobody, working on this little problem that, you know, it affected my life dramatically, but nobody else in the world. So it was that. And then the first time that I did a contribution on the Friday, the last day of DrupalCon, going into the Contrib workshop and learning about things, another person sat down with me for like 30 minutes to make sure my environment was all set up perfectly. And it's just amazing seeing the generosity and you know, you mentioned there, it's not just pulling in open source projects and using them, but contributing back to them. That's something that I really like about Amazy.io. And there's a number of companies in the Drupal community, especially, that I really respect for that. And that's one of the reasons why I was happy to have you as a series sponsor. So again, thank you so much for that.
You're welcome.
This series would not have happened without that. So thank you. It was like on my list of like, I want to do this someday. But then when you guys reached out and you kind of basically gave me that final nudge to actually do it. And so my hope is, you know, even if this is not code that we're contributing, that's another lesson I've learned from the Drupal community is doing things like this, teaching, sharing the knowledge that we have. That's just as helpful for so many people getting started with not just open source, but their career in software development or in infrastructure or ops or Drupal development or whatever it is, showing people how the basics are done and giving them kind of a springboard. And so I really hope that this series is that for people. And I know with the Ansible 101 series I did earlier this year, it has helped a lot of people. But just sharing this information inspires other people to share, and it's, we want to pay it forward. So thank you so much for what you're doing, for what you've done for the Drupal community and for Kubernetes now for the past couple of years with Lagoon. I know some of the projects that I work on, sometimes I see comments and things from people that work in Amazy, and it's great to see that, even if it's not intentional, the cross-pollination all of our groups have together. But anyway, thank you so much for coming. And if you want to give one final little spiel with where people can go to find out more about Amazy, more about Lagoon, and how to use it, how to get started with it, or how to contribute if they want to look at the open source side of things. And then we'll conclude from there.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, in the end, if you're interested in Amazy.io, just go to amazy.io. That's our website. There's a contact form there. Write a message what you want to talk about, and it will land with me or somebody else of the team, and we're happy to talk. Like I said, we have so many teams that really struggle with running Kubernetes, and our idea is, like you just said, it's also helping these teams. So a lot of times when we run Kubernetes clusters for a customer, the team of the customer has access to the cluster. They have access to the Lagoon. So a lot of times in the beginning, we maybe manage everything for them, but over time, their team learns more and more and can actually take over some of the pieces themselves. We have universities that started using Lagoon where we managed everything, and today they have their own Lagoon running with their own Kubernetes cluster that they manage themselves. So what you mentioned about doing it in the open source, we also try to do for our enterprise customers, because not everybody has, like I said, has a team of security and Kubernetes experts, and they just have their boss telling them, I've heard about containers, let's use containers. And so then they're struggling and everything dies, and at the end they blame Kubernetes for not working, which is definitely not the right thing. So so that's the Amazy.io side. If you're interested in that, please reach out. We're happy to help and talk about that. If you're interested in the Lagoon side, to give it a try, go to lagoon.sh, which is our which is the site for Lagoon. We are in the middle of releasing Lagoon version 2. There is an alpha version, which makes a lot of the things much easier. We had a bit our own issue with like Drupal. We had some Lagoonisms inside, and we're currently fixing all of them. But it's fully able to be deployed inside clusters, and you will find there documentation on how to install it and use it. And at the very end, please reach out if you have any questions. We have Slack channels, we have Rocket Chat channels, we are in the Kubernetes Slack, we're in the Drupal Slack, or just via email. If you have any issues, questions, or whatever, please reach out, because I really believe that Kubernetes has changed the hosting environment and will continue to change it, but there is definitely a very steep learning curve, and I think as a Drupal community, we know what steep learning curves can do to people. And so if we can just help, if I can spend 20 minutes with somebody and make their day, I mean, why not? That's definitely what we also want to try. So please don't hesitate to reach out and ask questions. We're here to help.
Yeah. So thank you again so much, Michael. And, you said 20 minutes. You gave us a full hour here of time helping people improve their own Kubernetes journey. So that's awesome. And for everybody watching this, on Wednesday live, please subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications, because next week we'll have our series finale talking about Kubernetes monitoring. And I can't guarantee that I'm going to give you somebody monitoring your cluster 24/7 with a security team like Amazy.io. We will give you ways to monitor Kubernetes with logging and dashboards and metrics and things like that. But anyways, until next time, I'm Jeff Geerling.